I'm back today with a United Airlines whistleblower who people have seen on the channel before, Captain Dan Hanley. Welcome back to the show, Dan. How are you today?
Thank you, Jason. I'm glad to be back. I'm doing great.
It's good to see you again, Dan. You're joining us today from Barack Obama's favorite country, Pakistan. How are things over there?
Everything's balmy. It's like a spring day today. The weather's been great, really.
Wonderful. Glad to hear that. So, Dan, people who've seen you on the show before know that you were United Airlines 767 pilot, right? Was it 767?
Seven. Well, I did fly the 757 and 767, but they retired me off the 777.
777, even better.
Right,
And
right.
when you observed that yourself and your flight crews were not being protected by the methods that United had prescribed after 9/11, cameras on the planes, hardened cockpit doors, you blew the whistle both at ALPA and United. Give us a quick background on that, if you could.
Okay, well, it's exactly correct. The flight attendants and pilots that right after 9/11 were very fearful, and Bush and company were putting out the word that everybody get back on airplanes, everything is safe, when in reality there were no security systems set up. So I started just talking with my chief pilot and union leaders and sending letters to the company, and I got my chief pilot called me one day and said that the vice president of safety, because I'd sent him a letter because my reports were getting stonewalled, said, you tell that expletive leader that if he thinks he can do a better job than me effective Monday morning, he's the new vice president of safety. And I went, whoa, what kind of response was that? So
Yeah.
I persisted, and I developed a correspondence trail with emails and letters. I was even recording conversations with friends of mine. And I had built up enough of a file where I felt I could move forward. And when I was going to write a letter to the CEO of United at the time, and my union leader in New York said, Dan, please send it to me, and I'll forward it to Chicago to the lawyers over there to look at. So I said, okay, it's been going on for 2 years now. I'm not going to sit on it. So, I mean, we hadn't had federal air marshals on board for 2 years going to New York to London. So shortly thereafter, the union lawyer called me, and he had me on speakerphone with the grievance committee chairman in Chicago. And I said, did you read the letter? Does it agree with, is it in violation of Federal Aviation Regulations company policy of the ALPA Code of Ethics? He goes, no, you're abiding by it. I said, okay, well, you're my legal representative in the union. Do you recommend I send in the letter? And he said, no. And I said, wait a minute, I thought you just agreed with me that I wasn't violating any rules here. I've been stonewalled now for 2 years. And the grievance committee chairman said, and I'll quote him verbatim because I remember, he says, go ahead and send that letter in if you never want to fly another United Airlines airplane again in your life. So I'll make it short because the story is long.
Yeah, long story short, Dan, like so many other whistleblowers we've spoken to, you got drummed out of there. They ruined your life, destroyed your career, and that was basically it, right?
Right. So I've been since 2002, 2003, before there was even a 9/11 truth movement. I've been a truther, and I've met people along the way that have filled in a lot of details. But of late, I'm working with some guys that are walking, talking encyclopedias of 9/11 knowledge. It's amazing all the stuff that's going on behind the scenes here almost 20 years later
Yeah.
with pilots, engineers, you name it, there are lawyers, scientists. So they're all
Engineers,
working behind the
architects,
scenes.
all that stuff.
Right. So I see you got the website up there.
Right, and that's what we want to tell everybody about today. There's some new problem on my audio that people are going to be emailing me about that I'll endeavor to solve after you and I are done. But Dan, you've joined us today to tell us about the new organization and website that you've started, 911pilots.org. What is that, and what's the purpose of it?
Okay, you said I started. Well, there's a group of us that actually started this thing, but I agreed to serve as director for it and a public spokesperson of sorts. But essentially, if you looked at the first paragraph, if you scroll down that, if you look at the slides going by, it pretty much tells the story. We're demanding the truth about 9/11, and and justice for the world. And then the next question is asked, could unskilled pilots do this? And it's answered in the next question, highly skilled pilots couldn't do it. So what our organization is saying is that we believe that these poorly trained and inexperienced alleged Muslim hijackers could not possibly have commandeered those airplanes and flown them the way they flew them. And what we're going to do is recruit pilots globally, and we've got a system set up to do it that we believe is a pretty effective. The whole system's in place, and we're going to have them contact us via our website, and later then we'll be sending out affidavits to them via email, and it's a simple PDF fill-in format, and they just download that onto their computer, fill it out, then upload it onto an email and send it back to us. So we've got a whole system set up to sort through these things, and there's 290,000 pilots roughly in the world today. And even if we only captured 10%, that'd be 29,000 people. So we're set up for that. And we're presently in communications with the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. They're not legally representing us, and we're not working directly with us. I had a conference call on Skype last night with 4 of their board members, and we agreed that they had to remain objective in what they're doing. So until that point in time where we feel that we have enough evidence, talking to our legal team, where we can come forward, perhaps in the future, and there's no guarantees here, that the Lawyers Committee will pick up on it and draft up a petition to the U.S. Attorney in New York, Jeffrey Berman, or perhaps another district attorney, and convene a grand jury investigation, such as we see that the architects and engineers and a number of other people have done.
Right. And you're going to be working with the architects and engineers, isn't that correct?
Well, no, they're separate. Their focus is on strictly World Trade Center buildings 1, 2, and 3, claiming with the evidence they have and the witnesses they have that they were all brought down by controlled demolition. And that is what they're going before the grand jury. That's what they approached the U.S. Attorney in New York with, the evidence. There were 57 evidence packages, I believe, that were presented to the district attorney there. U.S. Attorney there.
Yeah.
Excuse me, but as you know, grand jury investigations are very secretive. I mean, jurors can't even talk to one another outside the room. If you appear as a witness before one, you're not allowed to tell anyone about it. So at the conclusion of these things, and I'm not really sure how long they last, the jurists themselves can submit a summary report of what their findings were, but
Right.
It doesn't take a unanimous vote, a verdict to have it go forward into the court system. It just takes a simple majority, unlike your other.
Yeah, it's not one of these things where it's beyond a reasonable doubt. A grand jury is about assembling evidence, impaneling a jury, showing it to them, and their determination is, do we have sufficient evidence to conduct an investigation and have a trial? But as far as I understand, the lawyers have been still meeting some resistance in their efforts. Isn't that the case, or do we know?
Yes, I believe they have, and I don't want to be quoted on this as to where they're going, but I believe they were going to file suit against the Justice Department, demanding that they're meeting resistance all the way around, all the way up to the Attorney General, I suppose.
Man.
But they're hiding behind some law that says they're not required to divulge what stage the investigation's in. So you might want to bring. Go ahead, Jason.
I was going to say, we can understand to some extent the secrecy that's required to preserve the integrity of the grand jury, but it's troubling to me that, William Barr was heralded as this champion of the Donald Trump Justice Department, And it just seems like he's another do-nothing, Department of Just Us kind of deep state jackass who's just running interference. Trump, one of the things that I recall he campaigned on was this notion that he was going to reveal 9/11 truth, but that doesn't seem to be happening.
Right. I don't see it happening at all. I'd be amazed if it happened. The only way we're going to get it right now, the only legal act on the planet right now is the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 inquiry. Nothing else is going on. I mean, we can have programs like this. The mainstream media ignores us. So the only way we can go forward right now, I believe, is through the U.S. Court system. So that's what we're trying to do with pilots. And I believe the majority of pilots in the world, and this is my opinion, but I believe that they think the official story that these hijackers flew the airplanes is ludicrous. But they had, since 2002, I thought it was, but there's never been a legal channel or any legal action taken. I've been out there shouting and screaming about the uninterruptible autopilot since 2006. So
Right.
this is the first legal opportunity we have right now. If you want to go back to the homepage on the website, Jason, I can walk
Sure.
people down, because that first paragraph on the first page, if you scroll down, summarizes.
Here we go.
Okay, that first paragraph pretty much summarizes what our mission is, which is what I just told you, that we're going to find highly qualified and experienced both civilian, military, and commercial airline pilots, retired or active duty, and we're going to get in touch with them such that we can start this legal process with them. And it's been 20 years almost since 9/11, and most people, they don't remember the flight numbers or who the hijackers were or what the flight profiles were. So the website is really designed not just to re-educate the pilots as to what occurred, but also the general public, and that the menu page sort of walks you down that path to see what it is we're actually looking at. But I give an example there of the Pentagon attack and what the maneuver was required, so people have it fresh in their mind that this pilot could not possibly have done it. And then I mentioned the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 inquiry, and what we're asking people, I came on hopefully to broadcast, that's our interview we did there, Jason, down below. So what we're asking right now is we're trying to get the link 911pilots.org out to everyone in the world using a social media. We don't have a share button on our website, but we'll have it on Charlie. It's still under construction, but we've got the basics to move forward with it. So we're asking people to enlighten your family, friends, and neighbors just to look at the website information and make their own decisions, because we know that our government's lied to us about this in many ways, and we're going to hold them accountable.
Yeah.
Either that, this will be the true test of the U.S. justice system. These cases right here is the biggest crime ever committed on American soil.
It's one of the biggest crimes ever committed in human history. But when we look back on other, similarly massive crimes, really the only one that we can think of prior to 9/11 is the JFK assassination. We could argue that the Las Vegas shooting or some of these mass shootings, or perhaps the mass shootings in totality, are another type of false flag psychological event being perpetrated against the general public. But when we look at that JFK assassination and the lack of transparency that's come about since it occurred, it's kind of easy to see a future where we'll never know, or at least the government will never admit what actually happened on 9/11. We should also remind people, Dan, that you've got a YouTube channel that people can visit. It's 9/11 Pilots, and I will put the link into the description after this video is done. I'll include it in the chat right now so that our viewers on YouTube and Periscope and Facebook can get the link and subscribe to your channel. We also have people who are going to be viewing us on patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. People can visit Dan's new website at 911pilots.org. Dan, you were one of the first guys to speak to me about the difficulty that these, minimally trained pilots would have executing these maneuvers. You were talking just now about the Pentagon. Is it even within the, what would you call it, the performance envelope, the operating capabilities of these jets themselves to do this type of thing, irrespective of the pilot behind the stick?
Well, if you went to our hijackers page on the drop-down menu, you'll see the speed at which the impact occurred for each airplane. And roughly speaking, I'll talk in miles per hour to give people an idea. They were each traveling around 500 miles per hour, which actually exceeds the maximum operating speed of a Boeing 757 or 767 at sea level by about 120 to 140 knots. Now, when you get above that maximum operating speed, a lot of bad things start to happen to airplanes, and we've got structural engineers and aircraft engineers that are looking specifically at that, and that part of the story seems impossible as well. Now, if you look at the bottom picture there, you'll see that he was a very young pilot. That's Hani Hanjour, and the bottom picture there, and where the other two don't have that many facts because Flight 11 that hit the North Tower was a straight-in approach, and there was just a slight bank for Flight 175 that hit the South Tower before he struck. But this guy was a stunt pilot here, and he was only, age 29, and he had a commercial license, and he started flying, I believe, he started flying in the 90s and then went back to the Middle East and then came back shortly before 9/11. We're going to link their names to the Wikipedia articles, but I put a bunch of notes down there, or we did, a bunch of notes down there about Hani Hanjour's lack of experience. He was a poor pilot. Shortly before 9/11, he was going to rent an airplane, and his flying skills were so poor they wouldn't rent it to him. And yet we're led to believe that he could take a 757 at 500 knots just west of the Pentagon, do a descending, accelerating 330-degree corkscrew turn, pull in a lot of G's, and then ram full power to the engines just about as he's approaching the building, and managed to strike the building right at ground level. Well, there's a group out there called Pilots for 9/11 Truth, and a friend of mine, Rusty Amer, is probably the most experienced pilot in the world. And what they did was take a young pilot, put him in the simulator, and they replicated that maneuver, and every time he tried it, he crashed. And at the end of the video said, you couldn't do it, and I couldn't do it either. So that right there is a smoking gun, the lie of regarding the pilots, the Pentagon profile.
So this is the radar data from the official report that says that the plane flew in this way. Why would it do this, Dan? Wouldn't it just take a straight line, boom, right here? Why do this corkscrew anyway?
It might have been too high. They were aiming for the intelligence center.
Right. But again, that's something a very sophisticated pilot would do, right?
What's that?
I mean, this notion, to me, it looks like we got a line right here. Why don't you just go, boom, point the straight line right into the building? We've got to do this 180-degree turn to...
Well, he could have been too high and had to lose altitude in the turn.
But I'm just saying, even knowing that seems like something you'd have to be a fairly experienced pilot to try. If this is the first and only time you ever do this, you might make the wrong choice.
Right. So it's an impossible maneuver given his experience level. And that on the affidavit we're sending out, we say, do you or do you not believe the hijackers could have performed the maneuver? And they answer yes or no, and they give a reason. The affidavit itself, we're asking their education background, their flight experience, their aircraft they've flown, et cetera, the number of flight hours they have. And then we ask them to form an opinion, and we ask a couple lead-in questions that they could answer. So we know it's going to work. and we're
Yeah.
real optimistic that we're going to get a lot of pilots to come in. And you can go, if you go up to the top of the home page there's a Join Us page. If you click on that, that isn't just for pilots. See the Join Us there up at the
Yes.
top?
Right there.
Yeah. You click on that. We're asking it says for pilots and the general public. And the reason is we're going to be sending out news updates periodically, and we want everybody's email address because we got a system that can pump out a lot of emails over a short period of time. And we made it real simple. First name, last name, email. We need their country just to get the country code for the phone call. So all they got to do is put in their country and their home phone number. And then if you scroll to the bottom there, Jason, you'll see there's a comments box. Right at the bottom, it says for pilots. I can't read it now. It says
If you're,
if you're a pilot,
aircraft type.
the type aircraft you're flying. So
Right.
we've got a separate box on our database. We can look real quick and see what qualifications the pilots have, just what, depending upon what they fill in on that box. So that's our primary method of communicating with the global population that we hope to connect with.
Mhm.
And I just wanted to emphasize the point that if you're not a pilot and you come to the website and look at it and it says contact us, you may think that it's just for pilots that we're looking for, but we're not. We're looking for everybody.
Right. And so you mentioned this organization, Pilots for 9/11 Truth. They're the ones providing some of this radar data with regard to the Hani Hanjour, the alleged Hani Hanjour flight into the Pentagon. I want to take you back to that just for a moment. So let's say this is an aircraft type you were rated on, right? This was a 767 that allegedly hit.
Well, I was a 757 at the Pentagon, but yes, I was rated on that aircraft.
Right. So, is this maneuver even something that the aircraft itself is capable of? You spoke about the aerodynamic forces operating the plane at these speeds at sea level, which is the altitude that the Pentagon is constructed at. And just to clarify for people who might not follow that fully, this is not necessarily a regulations thing. This has to do with air density, the airframe strength, aerodynamic forces. It's physics, right?
Right. And federal aviation regulations actually require when you descend below 10,000 feet, you got to be at 250 knots or less. And this guy came smoking in at 500 knots. So
no, that's a regulation,
the
though.
speed,
Certainly the plane can violate regulations. It can't violate the laws of physics.
Right. And that's what the engineers are looking at. I posted on Reddit today a link to the site, and I immediately got a real long comment from an aircraft engineer that wanted to go off and talk about Shanksville and what hit the trade centers, et cetera. And I said, the scope of what we're doing is so narrow as compared to even Pilots for 9/11 Truth. So looking at the whole broad picture, we're just taking one segment of it, the pilots and the hijackers, and asking them the question, could you have flown the airplane? Could they have flown the airplane? So that's what we're seeking that in terms of the affidavit goes.
Yep. Yeah. Now, the other thing, Dan, you have been rated during your career on the Boeing 727, and you were very helpful in communicating with me, mostly offline. We've spoken about it a bit in a show that we did with David Hawkins, where we touched on the history of you having communicated with Field McConnell and introducing those two guys that ultimately resulted in the creation of Able Danger. But you and I have communicated quite a bit about some of the unique features and capabilities of the Boeing 727, a discontinued aircraft that oddly seems to be in sort of demand these days. I've been wondering, Dan, and I'm not sure if I've asked you this yet, but I wanted to. We've spoken about this rear door on the fuselage of the 727 that was designed initially to be a descending stairway that would allow passengers on this commercial jet to embark and disembark from the tarmac. This jet was built from the mid 1960s until the mid 1980s. It's a Boeing Tri-Jet. Now, we've also discussed how this rear door could be used to drop things out of the plane in flight. If the plane were to descend to an altitude where it could be depressurized, something below, say, 15,000 feet, and if it dropped to a speed that was low enough, but within the, obviously not below the stall speed. The 727 is also renowned for its remarkable maneuverability at low speed and its stability at low speed. Do you think it's possible that a JDAM equipped bomb could have been loaded onto a chute on these stairs and a 727 could have flown over the Pentagon, and that radar signature of the corkscrew that we see could be from a bomb that was released out of the back and propelled into the Pentagon?
Well, Jason, I've heard the planes, no planes. I've heard explosives in the building itself, and I've also heard of the flyover you're just describing. So I've heard compelling evidence for all those scenarios. Myself, working with this encyclopedia of knowledge that I'm working with right now, pointed out to me, everyone says that there were no skid marks on the lawn outside the Pentagon, but there was, in fact, the left wing dipped just prior to impact, and there is a skid mark from the left engine on the, well, we can assume it was that. I mean, I don't want to say for sure that's what it is, but there are some indicators that there may have been an airplane there. But
Really?
again, I know there's no airplane parts. I was just having a discussion with a woman on the board at the Architects last night about that. There's very few airplane parts, I would say. But see, that's all of what we're discussing right now is outside the scope of what we're doing with 9/11 pilot whistleblowers. We're not asking them to discuss the Pentagon profile or the Twin Towers of Shanksville. It's just the hijackers themselves and could they have flown the airplane. So it's a very narrow focus that we're dealing with.
Right. But I think a lot of people are still interested in knowing what you and other skilled pilots, what your expert opinion about some of this stuff would be. I think it's important for people to take away from this broadcast that you really want to publicize the new website, 911pilots.org, which is intended to create a consensus among professional pilots as to whether or not it is realistic for an unskilled and inexperienced individual to do this type of flying. I mean, what you're talking about, Dan, essentially, if there were to be some sort of civil or criminal trial as the result of a grand jury or anything like that, pilots such as yourself would be utilized as expert witnesses when it comes to cases that involve specific things. A lot of people have plenty of experience sitting in airplanes and flying around, but we don't really know what their operational capability is or any of that kind of thing. So you're essentially putting together a large body of professional pilots who could serve as expert witnesses.
Exactly. That's exactly what we're doing. And we're real optimistic at this point in time based on the system we have set up. We have a system we're going to buy that will enable us to get up to 65,000 email addresses of pilots around the world. And what we've done in a number of countries, I've contacted them on Skype personally myself and talked to them. I've got I keep saying we have coordinators in various countries that's going to work with us to try to get the word out. So it's really just a matter of getting 911pilots.org out to everyone and get everyone looking at the website. If you could go back to that drop-down menu, Jason, I can show you a few more things under menu there.
Yep.
At the top. The next one down is, we've got a motto and we got a memorial for the crew that died there. But if you go to the cockpits photo, we did this comparison on one of your programs. If you go to that, that's a Cessna 172 cockpit, the primary training aircraft that these pilots were trained on for their flying. And if you scroll down to the lower picture, there's a Boeing 767, and we asked the question, do you notice any subtle differences? So
Yeah.
we're going to blow those pictures up a little bit bigger, but it's obvious that getting in this cockpit, never having seen the airplane before, never having flown anything bigger than this,
There's loads of
it's ludicrous.
controls here. You're not even going to know what they do.
Look at the center pedestal on that thing. Look
Yeah.
at all the controls there. Look at the CRT instrument displays and all the information that's displayed there. And then if you go back up the top, the 172, the old round instrument. So there's no comparison between the two all the way around. It's insane.
Yeah. I mean, this is basically like someone who's only ever operated a rotary telephone, handing them a computer with
Right.
Skype on and asking them to place a call without really any training. Because they've had no
Well-
training whatsoever on a 767, right?
Exactly. And if you look at I had a good analogy pointed out to me regarding the pilots that hit the twin towers. I mean, at that speed, you had to be so precise with your flying. Someone said it would be akin to getting in a semi-tractor trailer, getting it up to 500 miles per hour, and try to drive through a Jiffy Loop without scraping the sides of the truck.
Right.
I mean, that's how crazy, because that 20-degree bank turn that United Flight 175 made close into the tower, had that turn not occurred, he would have missed the building by about 700 or 800 feet. So there was something guiding the airplane in close.
Right.
And it couldn't have been a pilot with that poor skill doing almost 600 miles an hour. So if you go to that next drop-down menu item there, Jason, it's your friend.
Oh. Oh, wow. I didn't
We talked
realize
about
that you had. Not my friend. This
Yes,
person
I
is
did.
not my friend.
I was teasing
Yeah.
you. I was teasing you. But we had to put him on there for two reasons. One, in 2006, I had a big email system. I had an organization called Whistleblowing Airline Employees Association, and Facebook and Twitter were just appearing on the scene. So social media was almost non-existent. So he contacted me one night about 8 o'clock at night. I was a Clear Blue. I didn't know him. He was a Northwest DC-10 captain. And he said, Dan, I understand that they medically grounded you for speaking out. I said, yes. He said, well, I've reported illegal modifications on Boeing aircraft. And if you scroll down the next paragraph, you'll see that Northwest, they were trying to get him to see this notorious FAA psychologist, Dr. James Elliott in Los Angeles, because they wanted to ground him for life as a pilot, just like they did me. So what he did, when I talked to him for a while, he said, Phil, don't do it. It's a setup. They're going to take you out. And so he retired early so he could later serve as an expert witness in litigation. But he continued his work, and he was the first one that told me about the uninterruptible autopilot back in 2007. And I
Right.
thought that answers my questions. But we put his flight resume there. He's the only guy I know that has Navy, Army, and Air Force wings, because he graduated from the Naval Academy and was in the Marine Corps. And then he went in to fly for the Air National Guard, and then finally wound up, I can't remember what unit he was in. But if you scroll down a little bit further, he filed a suit, and
Right.
it was tossed. He was going in court pro se, and the
Yeah.
judge tossed the case. But basically, it was against the exposing the uninterruptible autopilot on the airplane. So if you go to that next item on the drop-down menu, Jason, I can show you what information.
Well, I just
there,
want to address
because
this real quickly, because a lot of people jump to the conclusion that this case was dismissed because it's a deep state conspiracy against Field McConnell. But when I read the lawsuit, it was very improperly formatted and written and didn't properly state the claims. So I think it was dismissed for those reasons, although there is no denying that Field McConnell met significant and really probably illegal resistance in his effort to expose this. The illegal modifications that you're talking about are this Boeing uninterruptible autopilot. And to clarify for people who maybe aren't familiar with Field McConnell or yourself, there's some sort of oath that you take as a pilot, similar to a doctor's Hippocratic oath, that you're in full control of the plane? That what's the nature of that oath, Dan?
What is that? You're talking about the Airline Pilots Code of Ethics?
Right. Isn't there something in there that says that you have full control of the plane, and because of the Boeing uninterruptible autopilot, Field said he couldn't sign that?
Right. That's the Federal Aviation Regulations. It says the pilot in command is in command of the aircraft from the tip of the nose to the tail, from the time he releases, gets a salute at the gate to taxi away. So, yes, that is the case. That is a regulation. So,
So Field rightly pointed out that the Boeing uninterruptible autopilot technology allowed someone on the ground or elsewhere to take control of the craft, and so outside of regulations.
Right. If you go to the menu again, the next item is a remote controlled aircraft, and I'd love to talk about that.
Sure.
Because we put a lot of information on there. It follows in chronological order. That's why we introduced Field there. Now, remote controlled aircraft have been around since World War II, the end of World War II, 1944. The military conducted Operation Aphrodite, and they gutted out B-24s and PBY-4s. And the reason they gutted them was to lighten the weight of the aircraft so they could put 30,000 pounds of Torpex on board, which is a highly incendiary substance.
Why
the pilots were required? Why did they do that?
To turn the plane into a bomb?
Exactly. The pilots were required to make the takeoff, but once they got airborne, they bail out, and an airplane high overhead would remotely guide it into targets in Europe. And I put down there about Joe Kennedy. That's how he died, actually. He was on the third top secret mission. There's a 5-minute film clip on it that shows you that over 75 years ago, they were remotely guiding airplanes. Mm-hmm. So if you jump ahead to the next if you scroll down there, that is a Boeing 720 aircraft. In 1984, 40 years later, the FAA and NASA conducted a joint crash test experiment in a remote area, and they actually took this aircraft off. There were no passengers or crew on board, and they took the airplane off, remotely flew it, auto-landed it 6 times before intentionally crash landing it. Here it comes in here. That's being flown by remote control. It's empty. They were testing crew and passenger survivability in the event of a crash landing.
Doesn't look very survivable to me.
No, it does not. That was in 1984. So if you jump ahead to the mid-90s, we allege, and it's based on testimony, that the uninterruptible autopilot was developed. There's a Wikipedia article there that actually acknowledges that Boeing patented this device in 2006. So it does in fact exist, but it's misleading because they talk about a switch in the cockpit, and they talk about a few other things that weren't on the airplanes on 9/11. And then it goes on to say...
I thought the whole point of it is that it's uninterruptible. There's no switch in the cockpit.
Well, they're saying pilots can activate, but the key here is once that system's activated, the pilots have lost complete control of their autopilot and their flight management computers used for navigation, and they can't regain control. There's 4 ways of turning off an autopilot. One is the switch you turned it on with. There's a little red button on the yoke or the steering wheel you can push, or if you apply a 70-pound or more force on the steering wheel or the yoke, that should disconnect it. But the engineer, the avionics technician that we mentioned on that page, Rob Balsamo of Pilots for 9/11 Truth, conducted an interview of him several years ago, and he actually worked on the system. They were doing a system test on the ground, and no matter what they tried to do, they couldn't override the autopilot. So the system exists. The system exists, and he was working on this in the mid-90s, so that's why we say you be the judge. Look at all this information. Look at the hijackers' qualifications. Look at what they did to the airplanes, and you decide whether the pilots, those poorly trained pilots, flew the airplane, or was it the Boeing uninterruptible autopilot, or then some people claim there were no planes, but I think that's absurd to say there were no planes. I mean...
Let's address that for a minute, because there's a lot of people in the comments even now who are saying there are no planes. And see, it's important, Dan, because This is one of the things that disinformation agents want to do. And that's not to suggest that anybody who is saying that there were no planes are themselves disinfo agents. They may be the victims of disinformation, because basically this concept of no planes, I had a conversation with John Lear about this. He's a big supporter of there were no planes and holograms were used. I happen to have a lot of knowledge of holography and holograms and how they work and the theory behind how they work, etc. And with any technology, we could envision a future version of that technology that might not be possible today, but if this compound or this thing or something were made to be lighter or more powerful or have more conductivity or whatever, there are things that we could envision that perhaps in the future might enable technologies based on existing technologies that are understood. For instance, even if we didn't know about the Boeing uninterruptible autopilot, which you and your associates at 911pilots.org, as well as some of the other pilots who are fighting for 9/11 truth, you've established quite a lot of information that indicates that the Boeing uninterruptible autopilot is real. But even if we didn't have that information, we've seen remote control toy airplanes, we've seen remote controlled cars, we've seen remote-controlled aircraft that are quite large. It's not at all outside the realm of conception or possibility that such a technology could exist. When we start to look at the idea of holograms hitting those buildings instead of planes, I need some explanation for what type of technology would create such a hologram beyond the explanation that, well, the government has technology that you don't know about. I agree that they might, but I need some sort of explanation of that theoretical technology. No one has ever given that, and my knowledge of how holography works indicate that it would be absolutely impossible to create a truly photographic image that has no disruptions, no visible artifacts, nothing about it that seems digitally odd, that can be observed by hundreds of thousands of unique viewers from different viewpoints all around the city, moving as fast as it did, over as large an area as it did, impacting the building in perfect coordination with explosions and things like that. I think there are a lot of indicators that planes hit the World Trade Center. We've seen, at least I've seen, no evidence that a plane hit the Pentagon. It looks to me like a round missile hit the Pentagon. We don't see that type of ellipse cutting into the body of the Pentagon that we do in the World Trade Center. Many people say there's no way an aluminum plane could cut through concrete and steel. But isn't it true, Dan, that if a plane is moving at a certain speed and it clips a telephone line or something like that, it has no impact on the plane and it disrupts the telephone line because there's so much force generated by the mass of the aircraft times its velocity squared. If you're traveling very fast, you'll break through that line with no problem to the plane, but at a, below a certain speed, a power line can crash the plane. Is that true?
Right. Yes. Yes, that is correct. And I know about the telephone poles knocked down. The person I'm working with has as much information as I would say Pilots for 9/11 Truth, if not more. And he's given me both sides of the argument about whether or not a plane hit it or a missile. There's some people that said there were no planes, that there was an explosion inside, but I haven't seen any conclusive evidence to prove absolutely beyond a shadow of a doubt that one of those occurred. So I don't try to speculate or offer my opinion too much because I've heard all the arguments. I've been on Facebook a long time. As a matter of fact, I'm permanently off Facebook because last week I posted something about the uninterruptible autopilot and I tied it to Malaysia Air 370 and the similarities between their flight patterns where they veered wildly off course, they lost radio contact and their transponders were shut off. And I mentioned the name Jacob Rothschild and I posted 5 links to back up my assertions, and they immediately, within 5 minutes, said I was off because it's for security reasons. And so I tried to open another account. I was on it just a few days and they closed it again for security reasons. So when we
Who's
launched
security?
our website, well, here's the funny thing. They said when I tried to log on, they said your account has been disabled. Please contact the help section if you want to dispute this. Well, you got to be on Facebook to contact the help section. So you're locked out. There's nothing you can do. So this final time, I got back on and we launched the website, and I was posting like crazy and trying to reconnect with friends. And after 18 hours, they said your account's disabled. So I give
sorry,
up
Dan,
on Facebook.
real quick. We've got somebody in the comments here, Casey Tenor, and this is another topic I want to discuss. You've got a military background as well, right? You were in the Navy, I think? What was your military background?
Me? I was in the Navy, yes.
Right. So for every Boeing commercial aircraft, 767, 757, there's a military version of that craft as well, right? I think it's the KC-46 in the case of the 747.
Well, you're talking about the tanker?
Yeah.
There was a KC-135 was a 4-engine tanker jet that the Air Force used to use refuel airborne planes there while they're airborne.
I'm talking about the Boeing Pegasus KC-46, which, as I understand it, is essentially the same airframe and, based on the design of the 767, but is a military aircraft. It says Boeing KC-46 Pegasus is a military aerial refueling and strategic military transport aircraft developed by Boeing from its 767 airliner. So the point that I'm trying to get to is, if the average person saw this flying in the air, it just looks like a 767. It's painted differently. It doesn't have the standard windows. But once the Air Force takes delivery of this plane from Boeing, or even before they do, it's reasonable, this is my speculation now, but it's reasonable to assume that we don't need to assume, we can look right at this and we know that there are certain differences between this aircraft and a 767. There are no windows. There are likely different engines on it, or there certainly could be different engines than what we have on a 767. In fact, the Air Force on their own or through Boeing or any other manufacturer could modify this plane in ways that would be classified because it's owned by the Air Force, and we as civilians have no right or need to know what they're doing with the airplane. Now, the question I have for you is it conceivable, based on what you know as a pilot about aerodynamics and the operation of a wide range of aircraft, could something like the KC-46 or some other aircraft based on the 767 be modified to perform in ways that the 767 cannot, perhaps to fly at 500 miles an hour at sea level or do some other things?
Well, I'm not an engineer, Jason, so I don't feel like I'm quite qualified to answer that question, but it seems like a reasonable possibility that they could.
Right. I mean, we know you could buy a Honda Civic from Honda. Maybe it has 100 or 150 horsepower, but there are race car modifiers who would turbocharge it, change the engine, put on different tires, bigger wheels, etc. By the end of that process, it might be 400, 500, 600 horsepower, and certainly it would exceed the operating capabilities of a factory-bought Honda Civic. I'm just presuming that similar things can be done with aircraft. There are aircraft that travel at supersonic speeds, which must have stronger control surfaces, lighter, sturdier materials that they're made out of. Lots of ways that anything could be modified to improve its performance. So I remain convinced that some form of aircraft did hit the World Trade Center. And again, people are giving me examples saying like, oh, there's no debris in the hole in Shanksville. I agree with that, but that has nothing to do with what happened downtown here in New York City at the World Trade Center. People need to separate these incidents in their mind and realize that this was a complex, coordinated event.
Well, you talk about those different accidents, and they're talking about Shanksville. The Lawyers Committee has announced that they are working with people, and they are going to open up investigations into those specific areas, taking all available evidence, try try to force the grand jury to look at the information that they have. So,
Right.
for me, because Flight 175 was cited by so many observers, and they'll argue that that was a hologram that they saw, but the fact that some people did in fact say the aircraft had no windows, the fact that some people said it was painted gray, that was no United airplane. I think the woman was screaming, "That's not American, that's not American." But they have video clips of people actually saying this, and I just feel like there's too many eyewitnesses. As far as there not being any debris and the fact that it smashed into a building of steel and concrete, to me it's akin at that speed to run into a cheese shredder. The airplane just disintegrated on impact, and parts flew out the other side, but they were so minuscule because of the explosion that ensued that there wasn't anything left of the airplane.
Right. Well, no, a lot of people talk about how the nose cone can be seen popping out the other side. I agree that there's something seen from certain angles that are difficult to identify. I really do caution people that they need to be careful what evaluations they make from videos that are shot at low resolution and only 30 frames per second. Other people comment that after the plane hits, this streak that shoots out, I believe, is an engine that was found on the street, and it was not an engine that matches the type of what's fitted to a United Airlines plane, which is, again, causes me to speculate that perhaps the plane was something other than a United Airlines plane. There's one really pretty good angle. Here, I think this is it. We can see the plane coming in. No, it's not it. There's one really good angle where you can see that it is a very dark-bodied plane. Here, this might be it. So here we see the plane traveling for quite some distance. And for a long time, I thought it looked very dark because the plane was in silhouette with the bright sky behind it. But actually, we can see quite clearly from the shadows on this building and the other buildings that we're looking at, the sky is on the front side, the north face of the towers. The sun is on the north face of the towers, shining right at the airplane, and we can see, maybe this isn't the video, but there's a couple frames right before it hits where you can see a specular highlight on the dark, that's it right there. You can see a specular highlight on the dark fuselage of the plane. See that, Dan? So here we see dark plane, and as it flies into a beam of sunlight, we see 1, 2, 3, 4 video frames where there's 2 specular highlights on the body of the aircraft. A specular highlight is a hot spot like on a pool cue ball when you see that white spotlight on something. So there's several frames here. People have speculated that this is the plane launching a missile. I believe the illumination from an incident like a missile launch would last the duration of 1 video frame or less, not the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 frames. We see that specular highlight happening. And I agree with you, Dan. If this plane was capable of traveling 500 miles an hour, I think the force that the aluminum plane generates would be what penetrates the steel and concrete. One of the designers of the building said it was designed to act like a screen door, like a pencil going through a screen door. I know this I know this is outside the scope of what you intend your new organization, 911pilots.org, to handle, but I think it's valuable for us to discuss, and I think the notion of assembling an international team of professional airline pilots who can act as professional witnesses in what will hopefully be forthcoming grand jury investigations and civil and criminal trials that will hopefully happen. I'm hopeful that 911pilots.org will expand beyond the present scope, and perhaps the pilots that you will connect with can provide us with expert testimony on all these different questions.
Yeah. I admit the scope of what we're doing is pretty narrow. It's answering one question, really, 1 or 2 questions. One
That's
about the airplane, 2 about the pilot.
Right.
Yeah, and we got to start somewhere, and there are legal processes in place to make it happen. So we're going to provide the framework to connect collect the information and present it to the right people, and hopefully we'll get moving on some kind of legal action. It might take a while, but that's dependent upon how much publicity the website gets, and we have ways of publicizing it.
Right.
So,
And people who are supporting what you're doing can help you in this effort by financially supporting the effort here on 911pilots.org. Obviously, there's a lot of work that goes into making websites and starting legal campaigns and things like that. So people who are interested can help you do that. We have just a few minutes left, Dan, and I know it's getting very late there in Pakistan. Have you seen Imran Awan walking around by any chance?
Imran Khan?
Imran
The
Awan.
prime. Oh, no, I haven't. I don't even know who that is, actually, Jason.
Conversation for another time, perhaps, but is there anything
okay.
else you'd like to cover before we end it for today?
No, that pretty much summarizes. I want to thank you for having me on the program the fourth time. And I just want to encourage people to come and visit our website and look in detail at the information that we provided you there and form your own opinions. And if you have family members, if you're a 9/11 truther and you have family members that think that you're a tinfoil hat, then you might invite them to look at the information on the website and form their own conclusions. I'm convinced that 99.999% of the global population fell for the official story is because they're not pilots. I can't realize the absurdity of the notion that these pilots flew those airplanes. So that's our aim right there, to get pilots to step forward.
It's a good aim, and I would augment what you're saying by adding the possibility that people are also convinced of this official story, because I think there's a psychological technique being employed. When someone is so traumatized by an event that is so shocking that it literally stops everything, it shocks the conscience, I think there is a vulnerable time period where you're open to accepting a story from a figure of authority that explains something that you have no explanation for. And I think people cling to that. And this notion of, sort of being sold on the first story that you hear when it's spoken authoritatively from authoritative figures, I think that plays some role. And I think that is, in part, the goal of the people who have perpetrated this. I think we know more about the facts of what actually happened than perhaps is appreciated, but whether we'll ever get the government to admit this or hold the people accountable who actually did it remains an open-ended question. So I want to thank you, Dan, for the work that you and your associates are doing in the creation and promotion of 911pilots.org, and we'll have you back real soon. It's always good to see you, Dan.
Okay. It's great to see you too, Jason. Thanks again for having me on. I appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us. And thanks everybody for watching. Have a great day.